Well, hello. So, put your skin thins on. It is time for the Sandkings reread. First, I want to welcome everybody who is here. Thank you all very much for showing up and indulging us. There will be an after party open chat after this first discussion hour is over, because we're going to just hit a bunch of bullet points along the way. The point is to encourage you to read this story. And then we'll come back and then we can always come back and discuss it again. So who am I? I am Leech. And I am the one that has read all of the George stories. I have created something that I kind of cheekily call the Martinworld style analysis. You don't have to read all of these stories to understand A Song of Ice and Fire. They're just there if you do want to do deeper analysis with more plausible projections. It kind of helps you get used to the stylings that George has going on. And these are the co-hosts that I have ensnared for the evening. Let's see. First, we have SweetSunRay. SweetSunRay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello. So I'm SweetSunRay, and I'm going live from Belgium. It's 1 o'clock in the morning right now here. I'm actually someone who came late to George's work. I started with A Song of Ice and Fire, and that's only about like the third season of the show. And then now then eventually it expanded the more I analyzed and found and started to understand how George's writing style was. I became more and more interested in the rest of his work. And actually Leech introduced me to my second story outside of the A Song of Ice and Fire, and that was This Tower of Ashes. And then, so when 2 years ago I went to TitanCon, and I had a book signed by George. It was actually Dream Songs, and he was so over the moon that I didn't come with A Song of Ice and Fire book to sign, but actually his earlier work. He was so happy about that.
Yeah, we can discuss that in after party, but yeah, he likes it when you understand his and read his older work. Okay. Next we have, wait, which way am I going? What next? Go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit.
So real world name Jeff, Twittering and on Reddit as Shatterjack. I will answer to each because of the obvious Jeff confusion in the fandom. My angle primarily is about metatextual analysis, also overlapping into mythology and symbolism and linguistics and things of that nature. The thing that appeals to me about George's writing style is that, especially in the case of A Song of Ice and Fire, it really is stories about stories, and it can be peeled back and disassembled into its component pieces, and you've got references George is making to other things in the fandom, to H.P. Lovecraft, to Tolkien, all of the canon nerd works, as well as his own kind of vocabulary of symbolism that he uses. And I, being one of those guys that I think a good joke gets funnier if you take it apart and explain it. So not everybody feels that way, but George's books really do keep returning the investment of time to take them apart and to see how they work, how the individual pieces work, and what his vocabulary is. Unlike a lot of other things, there are a lot of fantasy stories that are, well, they might be a fun read, they don't really stand up to repeated rereads, and George is definitely not that way, which is why I'm here.
No doubt. Okay, so what has brought us together? Briefly, why are we hosts here? And I'm realizing the irony of calling us hosts in this particular story just at this moment. Anyway, George has entangled us readers into a web. I mean, when you start to read his stories, you really get completely entangled in them. We're submerging ourselves into the buttery vat of his fascinating imagination, up to the point we have grease dripping down our chins as we masticate every savory word. Sounds totally reasonable, right? I mean, this is what everybody does when they read stories. So why are you here? You also have a craving for deeper reasonings, which is only achieved with the line-by-line style analysis for character and plot motivations. That is what teaches us about Martin and his author's voice. And as Jeff was just mentioning a second ago, Ice and Fire isn't the only George story that benefits from rereads. Every one of his Martinworld stories, from novel, novella to novelette, should be read again and again. So briefly, what is Martinworld? Why do I keep calling it Martinworld? Everything George has written is part of his Martinworld body of work. So it doesn't matter the heading of the series. They are all his children. So we're not going to argue whether this is in Thousand Worlds or this is in some other contemporary time. We're talking about all of his children together, his author's voice. So then let's dig into Sandkings. And a quick reminder, spoilers everything. Any George shows, any other stories, the ending of this story, spoilers everything.
Other people's books.
Other people's books, that's true. Welcome to the disturbing tale of Simon Cress and his desire to be worshipped, this time by insects. But don't call them bugs because they are Sandkings. This character archetype is a favorite antagonistic villain of Martinworld stories. Oh yes, a naughty child of George's, but one of his children nonetheless. Published in Omni in 1979, Sandkings won both the 1980 Hugo and Nebula Award, as well as 1979 Best Novelette at Norris Con 2 in Boston. It has since been reprinted into many different anthologies, including the growing in popularity Dream Songs 1, which is right up there somewhere. And there's even a really cool graphic novel with super beautiful pictures. I'm a sucker for anything with art, so there you go. So what's the breakdown of this story? Basically, in the future, a jaded amateur creature collector purchases a few organisms of an alien species for entertainment to add to his menagerie. But when his desire for worship, or wordplay worship, such as we get with other items like the Iron Throne or the Fever Dream ship as it turns into Ozymandias, when this desire for worship creeps in like a madness, the Sandkings develop into a threat. This story exposes that bit of psyche that shows the reader that we don't truly know a character until we have seen the worst of them. You get what you ask for. I've taken this story and I've broken it down into 3 acts like a play, and that's how we're going to discuss it this evening. The story itself is on my blog. It's on my rereads under my reread section. I have about 25 stories. It should be the one at the top. It's the most recent. There are 14 sections in this story. Act 1 is the setup of inciting events. That's section 1, 2, and 3. Act 2 are the rising obstacles and character change, which is roughly about section 4 through 9. And Act 3, the final disasters, or when the fit hits the shan, because that's a Lord of Light, Rogers the Lasny joke that if you know it, you know it. The Act 3 is section 10 through 14. So the themes and topics across the works, from Sandkings into Song of Ice and Fire, the main one that I've already mentioned is the desire for worship, or a god complex. It's very Targaryen. It's very Euron Greyjoy. Yes, there are other somewhat gods that we want to call them in Ice and Fire, but the only ones that are actually going for worship or craving the worship, and we'll talk about that in the story. And another one is, I often talk about how Germ, or George, whatever you want to call him, takes one character from a past story and breaks them out into like 2 or 3 associated characters. So that's why when I say that we're going to see this behavior in Cersei, we're going to see it in Dany, we're going to see it in Euron, it's because they all come from the same root character. Sand Kings are essentially the Dothraki, then the Unsullied, then the Greyjoys, all coming together. That's the whole sowing red dragons thing. This is also, since we're also talking about Martinworld in general, not just to Song of Ice and Fire, this is also very much like the Harengan mines. The Targaryens, mainly Dany, and Euron's trying for this. I don't know how much he's going to really be able to achieve, but they're like the Harengan mines. The Harengans were humans' greatest enemy during the Double War, which is Song of Ice and Fire, Dance of Dragons, that caused the Thousand Worlds version of the Long Night. So again, we have these repeating themes over and over. Old Harenga is essentially Old Valyria, dragon lords, mind controllers. You'll see that in this story. Another theme that we'll see is chess pie. Chess pie is what I call it. It's basically food used as a lure to trap or ensnare somebody, usually for warring purposes. Manderley and Frey pie in Song of Ice and Fire is a literal chess pie. Another theme is hubris, especially disregarding the directions of someone wiser than you. In religious usage, it is meant as a transgression against a god. Again, we're back to that whole god complex theme that's in this story and Ice and Fire. Speaking of fire, 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 fire. Sword from the sky, the hive mind, Mother Maw Misa, the Grishka from a song for Laia. These are all very fiery elements. Puppy eating to build an army. What George did with the Unsullied was not random cruelty. That's not even something he invented for Ice and Fire. It's derived from this story. There's a what I call a CR or KR, like that strong cur sound and naming style. People that are associated, that have this name, typically are doing things, they're breeding for dragons. They're breeding for war purposes. The name Cress, Simon Cress is the main character in this story. The name Cress is an unflattering nickname for a greedy person. It comes from Old High German. It means greedy. Actually, it's pretty simple. Pretty right out there. So where do we see this greedy fire example? All over Ice and Fire, we are told that fire is a hungry god. It's a greedy god. It's always eating. It's always consuming. The most in your face example of this is in Dance in John 3, when the free folk are coming through the wall, and he says they came on clutching their scraps of wood until they came to feed them to the flames. R'hllor was a jealous deity, ever hungry. So the new god devoured the corpse of the organic shadows of Stannis and Melisandre against the wall. Speaking of the wall, in this story, the Sand King pit is somewhat like the ice wall or fighting pits of Marine. When the wall falls, the Night's Watch fails. That's the breaking of the wall that essentially lets the dragon through. We're going to see that in this story. A few more themes are poisoning attempts, fire and blood babies, which I have a strong feeling this is where George later developed the Araya Targaryen and what in her creeping eruptions. That's some sort of twist between horror and sci-fi. And then most terribly, turning on your own people, turning on your own worshipers. Yeah, that's going to be that's something we're going to see, and that's going to be tough. Let's see. So, lots of comments here. So I'm going to check in with comments, and Jeff, do you want to start with Act 1? That's sections 1 through 3. Do you want to start with Act 1 and kind of give us like your points, your notes?
So sure. A thing that Leach had recently posted to Twitter that was something that I observed is that Sandkings was kind of originally conceived as being kind of like a Twilight Zone episode sort of a story. And I picked up on that almost immediately. And it was, in fact, it was adapted for one of the Outer Limits, the reboot of the Outer Limits show in the 90s, specifically because it fits into that profile. I said that Woe in the story is essentially Rod Serling's character. It's a framing device where you have somebody that is passing through the story. And notably, that of all George stories, some of them are more subtle. This is not a story that is particularly deep and subtle. You see a lot of the imagery. You see all of the individual pieces that he will use over and over again. But he lays out the framework of the story very early because it feels like episodic TV. Like, you need to understand, Woe is the, creepy, otherworldly, presence. Like the Tales from the Crypt had the Crypt Keeper, or in the movie Something Wicked This Way Comes. You can just tell, oh, these are the weirdos that are coming in, and things are never going to be the same in this town again. Just everything in that first paragraph, there's mist on the floor, and you just know that within a paragraph, you know where this story is going. You know who Simon Kress is, how he fits in, and you'll notice Simon Kress is not a particularly well fleshed out character. He's very cardboard cutout. He's the bad guy. There's no particular reason for him to be a bad guy. He doesn't have any motivations other than he's just awful. Because the idea is by the end of the episode, he would be gone. He would meet his end, and you wouldn't, there's no reason for him to be well developed as a character. So even if areas you can see what's important to George by the characters that are well developed, like your Jaime Lannisters, and even Gregor Clegane in the main story has more background development. You kind of understand why he is the monster he is and how he got to the place he is. Simon Kress is completely disposable. What that tells you is that Simon Kress isn't really a character in the sense of the story. He's kind of a template for a certain kind of person. The story is essentially George's kind of class politics feeling lurking out. This is literally the Game of Thrones. This is the privileged class using lesser people or beings for their amusement. To point out, when Simon Kress first enters the story at the beginning of the story, he's not looking for god worship. Woe sells him on the idea that, oh, you should buy these because they'll worship you as a god. He's just bored. Like, he's been doing this with his he's got an animal called a shambler, which is basically apparently like a dog. We don't get the description in the story. He's had some piranhas. He's had some other things. This is just a thing that rich people do, is they use lesser beings as entertainment. And that George considers that kind of a cardinal sin. And Simon Kress is the archetype of that. So he's very, he's as manipulative as Tywin Lannister, but he's also kind of as sadistic as Joffrey. So he's kind of like checking all of the boxes. In the story, the Sand King, after he acquires the Sand Kings, they build their castles and they're not fighting. They're not providing him the entertainment he expected. And he complains about this. So he starves them of food to make them desperate. And this is something that will pay off later in the story, that's not something he should have done. But I can't help but think of that, the quote from Ser Jorah in Daenerys 3, where he says, "The common people pray for rain, healthy children, and a summer that never ends. It is no matter to them if the High Lords play their Game of Thrones, so long as they are left in peace, they never are." So basically, if he'd had left them in peace, the Sand Kings were content for the time to just go about their lives, and that wasn't providing him enough entertainment. So he takes their food away, so to make them more interesting, and that's a very like Joffrey Baratheon kind of thing to do. I guess the last thing I was going to mention was the idea of the shambler. Like, before he even goes into the shop to buy the Sand Kings and get infatuated with this idea of being worshipped, because this is like him going to the next level. He was very much interested in like the Fighting Prince of Marine, just lower class violence for the upper class amusement. He has a shambler, which in the story kind of fits the stereotype of somebody who has like a big fighting dog, just because it's fun to have something that you can sick on other things.
Yeah.
And in the main book, like Gregor is that to Tywin. where in Clash of Kings, where Tyrion is acting as the hand of the king, someone comes to them and complains that he says, your father's men burned his keep, raped his wife, and killed all his peasants. Tyrion says, I believe they call that war. Tyrion smelled Gregor Clegane's work, or that of Sir Amory Lorch, or his father's other pet hellhound, the Cahoric. And then in Storm of Swords, Tyrion talks to his father specifically about Gregor when the Dornish want Gregor as payment, and he says, or have you grown so fond of Gregor Clegane that you cannot bear to part with him? Tywin says, Sir Gregor has his uses, as did his brother. Every lord has need of a beast from time to time, a lesson you seem to have learned judging from Sir Bronn and those clansmen of yours. So the Shambler is like Gregor. He's a tool. He's ultimately expendable. They have no affection for them, but he's just a monster that they can sick on people. And so what Simon Cress is doing is basically going to the next level. Instead of just having a monster on a leash, he now wants to be worshipped as a god, and that leads to his downfall.
I agree. What
Yes,
about you, SweetSunRay?
Yeah, for the first act, one of the first things that I notice in the first act, especially in the first sections, is the shop. It's kind of this trope of a weird shop that suddenly appears, nobody knows before, and it looks small from the outside, but once you go in, it's kind of this it's mysterious,
Right.
and it's kind of this typical trope, and actually is kind of he also has that in the short story Monkey Treatment.
Yes. Yes.
Afterwards, it's cannot be found anymore, and it's
Right.
also a trope that Terry Pratchett uses in his Discworld. There's also this shop that suddenly pops up and then it disappears again, and it always has the things you need, so or the thing you're looking for.
Yes.
Right.
So that's one thing that stands out, and if I also like go into the text and like thematically where he borrows references. He uses it's on the planet Baldur,
Yes.
and the city where he finds the shop is in Asgard. It's called Asgard, and in the Norse mythology, Baldur is a god, and he's the son of Odin who gets killed by a trick with Loki, because like the Baldur dreams that he's gonna die, and he has every tool, every item swear they're not gonna hurt him, but they never ask it of mistletoe. And then Loki makes a spear, and then he gives it to somebody else, and they're throwing stuff at Baldur to prove that nothing can hurt him. But then the mistletoe spear kills him. And the other connection to that is like there's the road to the shop is called the Rainbow Boulevard, and aside from George using a lot of rainbow references in A Song of Ice and Fire with in the Faith, it's also in the Norse mythology. The rainbow is the Bifrost is the bridge between Asgard and the Earth, and then also in our common myth is like you find a treasure at the end of the rainbow, and the shop, the weird shop suddenly appearing with the Sandkings in it. It appears towards the end of the Rainbow Boulevard near the Star Port. And then another reference that is Lovecraftian is that Shambler that Jeff mentioned. And actually, there's a short story by, I have to check the author again, because where is it again?
Robert Bloch.
Yeah, Robert Bloch, yeah. It was written in 1935, and it's called The Shambler of the Stars. And it's in afterwards, Lovecraft, he wrote the sequel to it. So it's like a Cthulhu mythos figure that appears after an incantation and eats its wizard. In a book, in an incantation in a book that's called the Vermis Mysteries in Latin, and if you translate it, is the mysteries of the worm. So it's kind of, so already from the start, he references Lovecraft to kind of say like, this is going to be like a horror story.
Right.
And another thing that I really love is the faces on the castles. Even though like it's in the worship, but it's something we see in that is in a lot of stories, but also in A Song of Ice and Fire. The first example coming to mind is the Manticore at Cart, at the port of Cart, with that has like a humanoid face. And I kind of have a suspicion that maybe if we go by the third act, what happens throughout the Sandkings, that something is similar happening with the others, because they all look alike and they look like each other's twins, and we get that towards the end of this chapter of the story too. And then there's of course the concept of the maws, like when Woe explains how they work, the Sandkings, that they're like mobiles. They're not actually they're not really independent individuals, but they have a hive mind and are connected to an organism which she considers female. And it's kind of like a queen maw concept, and they're like four, but actually eventually it turns out there's at least a fifth one. And so that's the one quote that I want to pick up on what Jeff mentioned and what you mentioned that I really like is that George also gives a hint where the problem will be when the Sand King terrarium is installed. He asks her, "And my face? When will they carve my face?" And then she answers, "Turn on the hologram after about a month," she advised him, "and be patient. If you have any questions, please call. Woe and Shade are at your service." Right. She bowed and left. And then Cress wandered back to the tank and lit a joystick. The desert was still and empty. He drummed his fingers impatiently against the plastic and frowned. So he gets the advice of be patient, but immediately in the sentence after, we were already told that he's impatient. So he's not going to be patient. We're already told that from the very beginning.
Yeah. There's a few things that, like Jeff was saying in the beginning, that he is sort of a one-dimensional character. He walks in with an attitude. Every step of the way, he's impatient. He's attracted to these he has other animals and he has other options to buy other animals, but he's attracted to these Sand Kings because they worship. Bored. Yeah, he's bored, and they worship, and they war, specifically that they will war. And like right here, when Cress looked back at the tank, hive minds, interesting. He frowned again. Still, it is only an oversized ant farm. I'd hope for something better. They fight wars. And then Cress says, wars. Cress looked again. So that's what
this
made
is
him
not subtle. Right?
It's not.
Right. A 7-year-old watching this movie knows how this is going to end. Right. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the benefits I find to reading all of these shorter George stories is we have conclusions to things and that are still being worked out in Ice and Fire. So when we see this story in every single one of George's stories, when we see that in some instances it's almost line by line compared from one to the other, we can draw some really strong speculation between them. Right. Yeah, Cress is,
and also about the cartoonish effect, like when it's the fighting pits. I mean, from Slaver's Bay, a lot of readers say like Krasnys and all these guys. They're so cartoonish. Little background. They're so easy to hate. There's nothing sympathetic about it, but they are actually all Simon Cresses. They love having a fighting pit and
Right.
like
Yes.
Right.
that's it. There's nothing more. And it's the
Right.
same with Craster. There's nothing more behind them. They're just
Well, that's just to my point. Like it doesn't mean that they're one-dimensional because George is a bad writer, because clearly we have more developed characters in the same story. Whenever you see something that either doesn't make a lot of logistical sense, as if it was the real world, or you see a character that's kind of cartoonish, you should just understand that, oh, well, that's a placeholder for a whole category of things. Like
Right.
Jamie is not that way. Jamie is a fully fleshed character. Daenerys is a fully fleshed character. Jon Snow is a fully fleshed character. Krasny's is not. He's an archetype. And so you can start to see the outlines of the puppets that George is moving. The characters are moving through this world, but some of the characters are just cutouts, and that is useful information.
Right. This is part of the way that he sets the scene. He doesn't have to have everybody have a 10-year backstory. He needs these characters, these toy soldiers, to do this thing. He is setting the scene for the main character in the action, the main character in the series.
Right.
Yeah. So when
people who criticize like his characterization of the Unsullied or the Dothraki is, oh, well,
Right.
it's kind of an Orientalist idea that you never really get to know any of them. It's because of his Western ideas about foreign cultures. It's not, I mean, the criticism is valid, but there's a reason for it. Whenever you see a foreign culture treated as like a faceless mass of identical individuals, that's not an accident. That's not just like cultural imperialism. That's part of his writing process.
Okay, so let's go on to now that we know what the foundation of Cress is like. George sets it up so well in Act 1. So on to Act 2, the growing powers, the growing obstacles. How do you guys feel about that progression? Jeff, tell us about what you have.
I was debating on how to frame this, because I want to say, okay, it's about to get a little dark, but I guess if you read the story, you knew what you were getting into. He does this interesting thing here that I'm going to comment on. When Cress gets to the point where he stabs Kath Mullane with the sword, it reads very similar to the first time Arya stabs the guy in the stables. And they're too similar for me to think that's not intentional. That I think George is juxtaposing two things here. One is that if a normal, emotionally well-adjusted human being thinks about the thought of cutting up another human being into pieces, that's a horrible thing. But when you think about like fantasy violence, somebody going through a battle with a sword or an axe, you don't really think about it in the same way. Like the fictional violence doesn't seem as horrible as real violence, even though in the fictional violence, theoretically, the person is alive and not wanting to be chopped up into pieces. So I think the contrast of that, when he plays these scenes where a character kills someone for the first time, he takes away all of the fantasy dressing, and he just literally makes it about like you just stab the person with the knife and they die. It's just the way the text reads is very stripped down and basic. So in this story, it says, Cress shrieked at her and lunged. Before he knew what was happening, the iron blade had gone clean through her abdomen. Kath Mullane looked at him wonderingly and down at the sword. Cress fell back, whimpering. I didn't mean, I only wanted... She was transfixed, bleeding, dead, but somehow she did not fall. And then you compare that to like Arya's thing, where she says everything Syrio Forel had taught her vanished in a heartbeat. In that instant of sudden terror, the only lesson Arya could remember was the one that Jon Snow had given her the very first. She stuck him with the pointy end, driving the blade upward with wild, hysterical strength. Needle went through his leather jerkin and the white flesh of his belly and came out between his shoulder blades. The boy dropped the pitchfork and made a soft noise, something between a gasp and a sigh. His hand closed around the blade. Oh, gods, he moaned. His undertunic began to redden. Take it out. And when she took it out, he died. Like that is like the most undramatic, unheroic representation of murdering another person with a blade. And I feel it's the same way. Like this is George going, oh, fantasy violence is heroic. Actually, no, it's not. It's actually very mundane and very horrible and very gross when you take all the glamour away from it, from the urgency. So that to me, those read like the same scene.
And just real quickly before we get on to SweetSunRay, that same exact point, when he stabs Kath, that's a lot like Catelyn. The Catelyn, Catherine, he has a lot of these repeating Catherine type names. Usually a red-haired woman. She's more like a B-level fire person. Usually they're the ones that have some sort of a more sympathetic side to them. But anyway, so this Kath being stabbed and killed like that is not too dissimilar at all to Catelyn being, having her neck slit at the Red Wedding, which leads into like the whole Lady Stoneheart issue, which is something that he's had planned from the outline. So I don't think George gets us stuck in his stories, writing his stories as some people believe. He knows what's going on. So, SweetSunRay, did you have anything you want to add to that?
You can see the themes that I see is like, of course, there's the puppies. That's where it's in this second act that the puppies appear. That he starts to tell that, his Shambler once ate Cat's puppy, and that's why and then she left him. She's his ex-girlfriend, and
he just cut her up with a cleaver.
And then he makes the video of just to taunt her because she wants to end his Sandkings. He throws a puppy to the Sandkings, and then he videos that and sends that video to her, and then so that's something that expands, and it follows also with the expansion of violence. First, it starts in this terrarium, and it's just all these like little puppets or little ants that are warring for you. But once Cat uses the warhammer to smash the terrarium, the war expands beyond the terrarium, and suddenly he becomes. He goes
from being horrified at the violence to, I guess I just have to cut her up with a cleaver now, and that just like in the space of one paragraph, he's gone over the edge.
The cleaver is much later when he wakes up. He's gone with the wine. He's drunk. He wakes up, and then he finds the body, and he's like, he wants to kill the Ma, but then she does something psionic to him, and that's when he says, I'll just help. Oh, you know what? I'll feed her. I'll help them. And then he uses a cleaver. And that reminds me a lot of Craster. I have this theory, this tinfoil theory that actually it was Craster who murdered the Rangers of Benjen, and that some of them he chopped up with the axe and made into sausages. But
I wouldn't put it past him.
No. But so that's kind of like also the concept of the being eaten. Once this expands, that the war expands beyond the terrarium, his fear becomes that now I can, because he knows he used them cruelly, and also
once blood has been spilled, it started, and it just goes downhill.
It grows bigger, and we see that too, kind of like in A Song of Ice and Fire. We start with a friction. Once Cat kidnaps Tyrion, suddenly the whole Riverlands get embroiled in it, and then it gets bigger. It's rebels, but then it becomes 4 kings, the War of 5 Kings. And then we have Dany in Essos, who also expands from destroying Astapor to a whole war over the whole region. So that's something that it becomes more bigger and bigger and bigger. And then also something that struck me a lot is when Cress, he starts to search for the origin of these Sandkings, but he doesn't find it in his library immediately. And then he knows he should call Woe about it and inform, but he's too proud and is like, no, I'm not going to. And that reminds me a lot of like when Danny has a lot of opportunities to get information, background information from Selmy or Jorah. But when it's about the touchy stuff, she kind of asks, but that she doesn't. She cuts them short once they start telling stuff, and then it's like, no, I don't have time right now. And it's the same reaction with Simon. He's like, yeah, I've got other stuff to do, and then that's something. Yeah. Also, what but Jeff mentioned it already, is that the way that Simon wants to instigate the war, he uses hunger. He just uses hunger.
The Hunger Games, literally.
The Hunger Games, very basic stuff to make them war, which makes those Sandkings very crude, and he also sees them very crude. He underestimates them constantly, and then while Woe, she's more like, yeah, but they're very subtle. She's more like a chess player.
Yeah.
And he just like chess, while he finds himself a genius, but he's far from a genius.
Well, which is very Tywin, to my earlier point, is he really enjoys the being in charge part and using other people for his amusement part. And like Cersei is the same way. She just imagines that the small folk have no real feelings. They're not real people. And the story, I think George's story is that people, even if they acquire power, they always tend to underestimate those underneath them, which is why revolutions happen. And that's kind of his political feeling, is that the upper class will abuse the lower class until you get like the Sparrow movement. Like, Cersei doesn't take the Sparrows seriously in the same way that Simon Crest doesn't take the Sand King seriously until too late.
So a few more things that are like just broader Martinworld related. This story is not technically part of his Corpse Handler series or mini series, but he does use the link between mind control and corpse handling a bit. Like as the Sand Kings go and start to devour these people, their corpses start to move, and then as they're being eaten, Simon Crest starts to feel that same satisfying feeling of, oh, I've just eaten. As much as he tries to like drink the pain away, there's a stronger force that he's pissed off. Woe tells them, she's like, no, you mistreated them. Right. You basically went against their nature. Instead of letting them just peace, go through phases of like war and peace and let it happen naturally, and just feed them table scraps. It's once this Maw started eating humans, that's when a lot started to change. And that, again, that is something that's a big theme across many Martinworld stories, is specifically using the phrase the Maw. When the Maw starts to eat people, humans, that's when the fit hits the shan. And the another very prominent example of this is in Fever Dream. The ship starts off this very sort of like Weirwood Throne-esque Fever Dream, but it's only when Damon Julian gets in there and he starts to mishandle things, and he repaints it. He repaints this white ship red and black, and then instead of just feeding wood into the burners to get the steam up, they start chucking in people. And that's when, even in that story, that's when the dialogue changes from the burners, but they're not called the burners. I'm blanking on what it's called.
Boilers.
The boilers, thank you. That's when even the dialogue changes from the boilers to the Maw. And that's literally when the ship changes to Ozymandias. And we all know what that means. And so
that's some other week.
Yeah, that's some other week, but that's part of like his furniture rule. It's like a pen doesn't have to literally only be a pen to be a pen in something else. It's it's about the actions and the theme and what's going on. Okay, so that's brings us to, let me find my thingamadoo again. That brings us to the final disasters, like the results of all of this. So everything everybody does has a consequence. You are the result of your choices. And well, and to go back to Fever Dream again, that story has the best little monologue about what your choices mean to you. There's a couple of interviews out there where George talks about how villains aren't born, but they're made, and I think this might be where he says, oh, what about the little baby orcs and their baby orc cradles or something like that?
Right.
And he says, we are the result of our choices. So that's part of character progression. You might start one way, but you're going to end this way. Simon Cress is pretty one-dimensional, total bad guy in the beginning, but through his growing obstacles in the middle section, that's brought us here now. And now he's starting to see the results of his consequences. So, SweetSunRay, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's when he's lectured by Ro. She makes him very responsible about it,
Right.
but she's still gonna save him. But then even then afterwards, as he runs away towards the east, he's already thinking about revenge. He blames Woe and Shade, and he's being tricked and blah blah blah. But he never recognizes his own culpability in it. And then at the same time, in the last act, it becomes very clear how much while he's a mean, bad, evil guy in a cartoonish way from the start, more like a trollish guy, he also, you can start to see how much he's influenced by the White Maw. But he made her crazy because he struck her with the sword. It tried to kill her and wounded her, and it becomes like this sacrificial feeding. Every time he tries, he has no problem in killing the Black Maw or the Red Maw, but the moment that he wants to try and send people there, totally convinced that he now has got to destroy her, he pushes people into it, kills people to feed her. And that kind of also made me wonder at some point. It reminds me of the legend about the Night King and his White Queen, or his Corpse Queen. And the Night King, he's said to be this very evil man who sacrificed babies to the others. And you kind of wonder, like, maybe he was also in a psionic influence by his Corpse Queen and was kind of doing what Simon Cress does. So maybe Night King is also a sort of a Simon Cress. And then what I love totally is the ending where the metamorphosis is complete. And he always underestimated the Orange Castle because they were always late and they were too few and they were too slow, and he never thought they'd be anything. But eventually they avoid the whole complete war at around his house. They moved someplace else, built the castle, and then he runs towards it, and he thinks at first they're all little children, but then he realizes they all have his face. And that's actually my most favorite quote of the story, is like, he screamed because of the others, the little orange children who came crawling out from the castle and watched impassively as he passed as they carry him into the maw, all of them had his face. So that's I really love that he's and just like his at the start his pets ate each other, he's now being eaten by his own pets.
Right.
Jeff, do you have anything to add to that real quickly?
Well, I've got a couple of things. This is the point where, to my mind, the story starts to drag a little bit, because I get, yes, the space bugs are clearly going to eat the very bad man. Could we get to the eat the very bad man part? But no, the very bad man continues to do increasingly very bad things. He feeds them his friend, and then another of his friends, and then more of his friends, and then some mercenaries. And so this is the point where I'm yelling, just eat him already and be done with it. But there's a speed round of a bunch of other George stuff that's not heavily symbolic, but you're going to see this in other stories. When he kicks the woman down the steps, that's very much like Lysa being thrown out the moon door. Like, oh, but I thought we're friends. No, shove. Out you go. It's also very much like Cersei sending Felice Stokeworth down to Qyburn in the Black Cells. That's basically throwing her to the maw.
Right.
There is a point in the third act where one of the mercenaries I think it's Simon, is spraying insecticide, and he describes his insecticide wand as his misty sword. Like, I know that's a George thing. We're going to, look, it's a sword made out of mist. We're going to see that again.
Right.
There's a scene where as he backs away, he's fighting the Sandkings that are on the ground in front of him, and one of them sneaks around and attacks him. The secret attack from above. They're jumping off the house, which is something you see in this Tower of Ashes. It's that secret attack from behind and from above.
Right.
I got a weird line. I don't know what it means. The two mercenaries have flamethrowers that are spitting blue and red flame. I've never seen a flamethrower shoot blue flame before, but that's a George thing. Don't know what that means.
Yes.
There's the ambush where they undermine the Sand Kings, undermine it, and so that the mercenaries, they fall through the surface and are trapped to the waist, which is very much like to the Frey Outriders, that they go out from Winterfell in that Theon sample chapter. The Freys ride out and they fall into secret pits. So a stronger force that you would think would be a slam dunk victory falls into a pit and they're overcome. So that tactic will be deployed again. Lysandra says, oh, I have the laser. We'll use that only for the kill. The flamethrower probably won't be needed, but I want it here just in case. There are worse things than fire, Simon. There are worse things than fire. Okay, I see what you did there, George. Like that's a line we're going to hear in some other story somewhere. I think the punchline of the whole thing is that the exploitation is a two-way street. That basically the gods kind of get into a communion with their worshippers, but it's not strictly for the gods' benefit. That's a two-way street, and that's what always trips these characters up, is that they understand that the worshippers will devour the god, just like the god is exploiting the workers. That I think that's the essence of the flip, is that Simon Cress remade the Sand Kings in his own image, but his own image is terrible because he's a terrible person, and he paid the price for that. That is the punchline in the hook at the end.
Well, I want to go back and elaborate on a few things that you guys said, because I agree. I think for me the biggest transition, the biggest sign that there was no going back for Cress was when he with Lysandra, when he pushes Lysandra down the steps. I mean, he's even saying, you can hear it in his voice, and at the point he's like he
giggles.
He has no choice to do this, and it's kind of like, well, why not? But we know at this time that it's the Maw that is.
He's got the crazy eyes on at that point.
Yes. A few things about Lysandra that I want to talk about, like just for Martinworld purposes. Obviously, it's part of the name Melisandre, which if you look at my Bitter Blooms story, I give the story to the name Melisandre. So Lysandra showing up as a fiery hand, essentially,
and a foreign badass. She's
yes,
always from coming in.
And she knows Simon Crest because she's done work for him before. She's cleaned up his dead bodies essentially before. But also when they show up, when Lysandra and her team show up, they're described as being faceless men. And so we have little hint to the assassins that are, guild that is the faceless men. But also some of the other things that happened to Lysandra that we could use, to speculate what happens to other characters in Ice and Fire. When excuse me, when Lysandra gets that bloody wrist, that bloody wrist is essentially like Mance with his ruby wrist that Melisandre puts on him. There's the whole Blood and Fire Royal Ruby Association. There's also Victarion with his Volcano Fire hand. What's going to happen to Victarion? And then there are, and this is probably going to be something that takes place more like in Volantis, maybe Pentos, something like that. But the fiery hands that are the assistants to to R'hllor and the temples of R'hllor, like those are their mobiles essentially. Is
right.
They're called the fiery hands. So we have these blood and fire hands in this story, and we should be able to ask ourselves, what does that mean for the characters in Ice and Fire? Odd scramblings on the wall. That is something like SweetSunRay was mentioning. That and the Idiot God. Those are more Lovecraft nods. So yeah, we know there's this like existential dread that's happening in this story. The Silinx and
Cersei yes. Hears some sounds in the wall too, right?
Yes, and so does
Dany does at one point too, doesn't she?
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's actually
scratching on the walls of Marine or something. They keep her up.
I think it's Jiqui, I think, maybe. Yeah, it's one of her handmaids.
It's Dany chapter. I don't remember who hears it,
right.
But somebody definitely hears scratching on the walls of Marine.
Yes, they do. So
I think it's Missandei who
maybe
who
it is.
Like the people of Astapor who try to scratch their way in, or something like that.
Right. So those are some sort of existential dread. What's happening here is, your walls are going to crumble down. Whatever you're trying to do right now, your walls are going to crumble down. These mobiles are coming in. So as much as somebody like primarily Dany, but also the spokes that come off that are Euron or Cersei or those types. Those are the ones that we have to really pay attention to. Sand snakes are another, especially with the way that the orange group is described in here. They're kind of distant from everybody. They kind of go off on their own. You don't hear from them for a little while, and then they're going to pop up.
Well, and in general, every time the Targaryens go to war in Dorne, they say the army disappeared into the desert and refused to give battle. They just
exactly. So it's we can use this story to possibly give some reasonable speculation to what's which way Dorne is going. Oh, plus also in the TWOW, one of Arianne's TWOW chapters, Dorne is always asking her for a word. Is it dragon or is it war or whatever? The second chapter we get from Arianne is the word she chooses is war. So there's another warring sand something faction that's
a choice being made.
Right. The attack from above. Jeff, that you were talking about with where the one like comes off the roof. There's a line that Dani notes when she's on one of the ships and she's watching Rhaegal and Viserion out there with the fish. I think that's when she says it. And then Melisandre says something about this too, about a fiery hand attacking from above. Dragons attack from above is essentially.
Well, in that Battle of the God's Eye, that was actually used. Whichever one of the dragons climbs above the other one and descends, and during that final battle, there's
actually
attack from above. And
in a Storm of
and
Swords,
Harrenhal, same thing, right?
And in a Storm of Swords, when they're on the ship, Dani notes already that dragons prefer to attack and drop from high above to the bottom.
Yeah, and Night Flyers is another maul. Night Flyers is essentially like a dragon ship in space, and there's a character in there that gets consumed. It's almost like an ice dragon. She gets consumed, and it's through the maul. So yeah, I have a feeling in Ice and Fire we're going to see the use of maul again, like that word, a lot more in the next couple of books. Okay, so that brings. Yeah. And you guys have any other like concluding thoughts before we start to go into the after party? Because I want to get to a few more, just real quickly, a few more things.
One concluding thought I have is that like the fighting pits theme is it we have it in Sandkings. You also have it in Tough Voyaging in Beasts of Norn.
Yes.
And then you also have when you have it in ASOIAF, but in all three stories, the way it's being tackled is 3 times different. In Sandkings, you have it from the point of view from Simon Crest, who uses them for entertainment and abuses them. Is like, and then, but with Tough, you see a solution. He hates it. He hates it like Cat hates it, who wants to destroy the pits. The fighting pits, but Tough, he uses a completely different. He starts to introduce other alien. He makes alien animals for them to fight each other, but then they take over the planet, and eventually people are so forced to fight for their lives and for their survival that they don't have any. They can't spend their time on the fighting pits anymore. And with Dani, she's more like the cat who tries to stop it all and destroy it all, but it doesn't work that way. It also boils over. That's one thing. And yeah, of course, the whole metamorphosis theme, it's something I believe will come back with the others in some way.
Okay, so sorry, I'm getting a bit of it. I'm going to close that right there. Okay. So if anybody wants to read this story on their own and they want to see the notes, I have about 25 stories that I've done already where I sit and I type and I transcribe the entire story. It takes me a while to do it. And sometimes I spell that T-A-H-T instead of T-H-A-T. But it's funny how slowing down and going line by line with each story really helps you absorb it differently. So if you guys want to read this story or 24 other ones so far, that's where my blog thingamadoo on the screen right now is where to find it. I have notes all throughout the story. I did not even get to 1% of them here. Maybe we'll take care of some of that in the after party, but I don't know. We'll see. And then SweetSunRay, thank you so much for being here. I'm not sure how long you can hang out for the after party, but if anybody wants to read any SweetSunRay, Sweet Ice and Fire SunRay, essays, that's where to find her. But I'm also going to add her more of her information in the YouTube information square, whatever it's called. And then, Jeff, is there anything you want to add to this?
Not particularly. My Twitter and Redditting have really dropped off in the last year or two since the show has kind of wound down and the fandom has slowed down a little bit. So I don't have anything really to publish other than this stuff here.
So for this first part of the this live stream right here, thank everybody for being here. Whether you're popping in and out, you have lots of questions. I hope I was able to address some of them. If you still have them and you're going to be here in the after party, toss them out again. It'll be much less structured. We're just gonna chat for as long as it goes, probably half an hour or something like that. But I want to give a huge thank you to George R. Martin for his decades of plot twist, squash tropes, love triangles, jambles and jumbles, as well as the interregnum that never ends. Thank you so much, you tricksy bird. The after party will start in just a few minutes. It's going to be right here on this chat, and it will be recorded. So if you want to take place in that, that's totally up to you. But thank you for being here this long. If you want to read anything, all of my stories are there. They're read at your own pace. Leave me comments there or wherever else you can find me online. My next story that I have coming up is going to be Night Flyers. But I might want to do the Glass Flower first. I'm not sure, but I think I want to do Night Flyers because it's in the same section as this in Dream Songs, which is George calls his hybrids and horrors section. So that's fun. So thank you guys for being here, and it's after party time. Woo! Take your pants off. Woo! All right. So let's get back to some of this.
Let's get unstructured.
Let me check some of these notes or some of these comments I have coming up. One thing is and I noticed this in the comments, people were, and with us, people were commenting at how similar Woe and Shade are, or some of the ideas in Sandkings are, to Tough Voyaging, which is spot on, right on the nose. George said that he was essentially, and I have these notes on that reread page. George said that he was essentially going to write Woe and Shade as some sort of like mini series where all of these, like Tough, all of these disasters were going to happen, and
well, it's like Forrest Gump or whatever. It's a framing device that they connect each of the stories. Like you can almost see, like it wouldn't take a lot of effort to write the fan fiction. Whereas as Simon Crest is going into the maw, Woe steps out and says something pithy about, he wanted. He tried to create minions in his own image, but his own image was terrible, and that's the end you come to in the Twilight Zone, and credits roll. Like you can totally see that happening. That the woe is the brackets. You beat a little bit at the beginning of the story, a little bit at the end of the story, and that's classic kind of pulpy, like I said, Twilight Zone or Crypt Keeper or Something Wicked This Way Comes. There's always someone who's sort of ethereal and otherworldly. Like you just know if you walk into a store and there's mist on the ground, this is not going to end well. Like this is definitely otherworldly.
One of the other things is George has a thing for menageries. He has a thing for
freak shows.
This this collection of like like Tough Ship, like what's his face, the big yellow guy that Tyrion is with.
Big Bird.
Yezin, is his name Yezin?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and you know, we see lots of carvings and paintings of all of these going into Karth. It's like something happened there that was like George style interterrestrial, or like extra,
Right.
like all these different Terran.
It's like a pocket universe where the normal rules don't apply. I mean, for those of
Yes.
you, go back and watch the opening scene of Gremlins, where the guys sell the gremlin, like, oh, there's all these
That's
special
also
rules, like it's like this shop is clearly not adhering to like FDA or OSHA rules. Like we are way off the map here. You know, you're in a danger zone. And again, like something wicked this way comes, where the kids, oh, the circus only opens at midnight. You know, you're crossing. You're transgressing. The normal rules of society of time and space don't apply here, and that should be a warning to anybody sensible. But in these stories, it inevitably isn't. Like, oh yes, I will take your secret space ants. What's the worst that could happen? Or yes, I will buy your Tribble. Or yes, I will buy your gremlin. Or there's a whole category of stories that work this way. Somebody does something dumb because they see an opportunity.
Yes.
And regret it.
And that's the thing, is it's always nice and shiny when you first get it, and then when that starts to tarnish a little bit because you're not taking care of it the right way, that's when the fun right. creeps in. One thing, I'm looking at some of my notes. One thing that I didn't get to talk about much was the different animals that are brought in by the other competitors to fight the Sandkings in these battles, like this second arc thing. In section 5, if anybody wants to go there and just jump to section 5, that's where we get these giant spiders that come into play. So this is going to, in a way, it's part of that menagerie, these things that are bred for, and it's bred for war. This is something else that's bred for war. We have these giant spiders that are dropped in. So that is we can take a lot of that and put into Ice and Fire between the others with whatever their ice spiders are going to be. It's them coming in against Danny's group, at least at first. So,
right.
And then,
well, that's kind of my idea. That actually the others are ice spiders, and that they went to a metamorphosis and eventually have a human look and look humanoid, just like the Manticore has a humanoid head, but they're in fact insectoid or something.
But both the bug forms and the bipedal humanoid forms are just mobiles for a larger maw somewhere else. They're just different forms of mobiles.
Yeah, and that maw would be a queen and not a king or it would be female.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
subscribed.
And I think like with the white maw, especially, she always reminds me of the others. So I kind of think that she might have been wounded or something, or she's kind of mad as well.
Well, I think that was probably the insult to her person was the construction of the wall. That was the wrong that was done, and that's
her terrarium. That's the containment of the terrarium.
I mean, clearly in A Song of Ice and Fire, something is broken in the world, and we can debate what that thing that's broken is. But the fact that the seasons are out of whack implies that this is not business as usual. Something is wrong, and the resolution of the story is that the thing that is wrong will have to be resolved. And the wildlings are very upset about the wall. You built this wall, you did this thing. That the wall itself is a crime of some sort.
Right, because they split the land. The land is one.
And that was an offense, right?
And that was an offense because all of a sudden the free folk were no longer free. And that any free folk that they're like the food, they're essentially like the fodder to the others north of the wall. And they're trapped behind like the big aquarium wall that Simon Kress has, that he had this huge, enormous wall installed. They're trapped. They're essentially fodder. That's what is turned into whites, And like I said earlier in the stream, you know, this is not technically, Sandkings is not technically a corpse handler story, but there's corpse handling done in the story.
Right.
Yeah,
And
you get the jerky, and that's
Yes.
also typical. The jerking corpses you always see them featured in the wine cellar with the white maw. That's where they're featured. They're not with the black and the reds. You don't see
Right.
the jerking corpses.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
True.
like a white.
True.
That reminds me of a white.
Right. It's white aligned.
Oh, somebody just bought something from my shop. Yeah, that's another reason why I want to like jump to Night Flyers next, because that is also not technically a corpse handling story, but there is corpse handling in that story, and that story
Right.
overlaps a lot with the topics and themes that we're talking about here.
Right.
So it's a smooth transition.
Well, and to reiterate the general premise of this group of people and the sort of things that we're doing analysis on, this is all just George trying out different ideas. These are not, whether or not this is literally in the Thousand Worlds is kind of irrelevant. George is continuing to assemble different stories out of the pieces that he's been thinking about his whole career. So they are all connected, and the thing that connects them is his brain. So whether or not they are literally in the same shared universe is kind of beside the point.
Yeah, and then you also have like, especially the House of the Undying.
Right.
So you have the shade of the evening there.
Right.
So that's already a shade to
Right.
Sandkings. And then Danny is lured into being eaten. You have 4 figures that are prominent. There are more Undying, but there are 4 prominent, but there's one who is a woman, and she's also in an opposing or at the opposite of a table, and everybody
Right.
looks at her. So she's kind of like the leader. So she's probably the maw, because also
Right.
like the whole trail that Danny has to do inside that, it's so. Yeah, that's very Sandkings.
Well, she talks about the blue heart filled with corruption. It's not it's undying, but it's not really alive. It's not particularly healthy. So
No.
what you've got, that the heart is kind of injured and kind of like limping along, and the white maw is the one that was kind of injured, and like it's like a wounded animal. It's not quite right, and as a consequence, it's a little bit crazy.
And also, like, even when Piat he attacks Danny. Also, there's I think it's when Simon attacks Kat. It also reminds me of Piat Pri, who's so angry, like, no, what did you just do? And
let's see, I'm going back to a couple of notes that I wasn't able to get to before. Let's see. One of the other things I forget which section I have it in, but it's when it says where the hammer comes in and breaks the aquarium. That there's also a little, not only, and then that's when Simon he comes in not long after that. That's when he comes in as a sword from the sky. So it's like a dragon fire-breathing sword. It's a sword from the sky to try to take out another maw, because there can be only one. And but there's also a little bit of Robert and Rhaegar at the Trident in that scene as well. And then and if you think back to,
that's also the moment That's also the moment when, because in the story in Simon, he kills Cat, but then he sees the maw being, one of the maws, the white maw being carried away. And it reminded me of when Rhaegar dies. That's also the moment when Dany, but in the womb, is being carried away to Dragonstone, because that's when Aerys decides that his wife needs to
Yeah.
needs
Right.
to be
Get out of
gone.
here. Yeah, get out of here. It's and if we think back, so crossing the Trident, having that battle at the Trident, that's also something that Dany recalls when she's deciding whether or not she's going to get the Unsullied. She says it right in the chapter before she actually goes to get the Unsullied. She said, well, and she's thinking about the difference between what would Rhaegar do and what would Viserys do. And she actually makes the choice that Viserys does. She grows as the story goes on, especially at the very end of her arc and dance. She starts to sympathize and think back to Viserys a little bit more. And right here, she's right before she goes to get her Unsullied army, her mobiles. She thinks now's the time to cross the Trident, which is George writing in, this is where we cross the Rubicon. This is, which is essentially like a metaphor for like the point of no return, because that's when a lot of things in Rome changed and it went to, yeah. So, yeah, that's something I didn't get to in the main part of the stream, but something to keep in mind. Dany's making a lot of choices that when you first read them, you're thinking, all right, this is cool. She's liberating. She's not. She's collecting an army. And she wants that worship. She has people, just like Cyrene does. Cyrene is probably the strongest Dany prototype. That's primarily and only Dany is Cyrene. Even Cyrene has people outside of her pyramid, her big black obsidian angled walled pyramid tower. They're prostrating themselves. It happens in Seven Times Never Kill a Man outside of those pyramids. It's happening in Ice and Fire. They're prostrating themselves to Dany. They're becoming worshipers. Right. And this is quickly slipping into George's idea of going past just faith, past just religion, into absolute like militant zealotry. Right. So Dany's definitely on a very slippery slope right here. And I don't know. I guess the question I have now is, do you see this, aside from the obvious like Cersei and Euron, do you see this for any other arcs in Ice and Fire, just to balance things out?
The worship,
where people are, where the
well, there's a High Sparrow, of course. There's a High Sparrow, of course.
Well,
okay.
Yeah.
That's the Cersei part. So Cersei has her own religious militant issue she's dealing with, which is why
it might be also be present in Stoneheart.
Okay.
Yeah.
We haven't seen enough of it yet to be sure about that. But
well, Stoneheart is one of those characters that she's maybe not morally, but mechanically, she's kind of operating like Daemon Julian, where Daemon Julian is essentially the Maw. He goes into his bedroom and he doesn't come out and people don't see him for weeks. And he's the Bloodmaster that has absolute control over his people, and he sends them out into the world as his mobiles. And that's kind of what Stoneheart is that she sits. She doesn't do anything actively herself. She sits and sends her her mobiles out into the world to take actions for her, bring me Jaime Lannister, bring me Brienne, whatever. I don't know where that goes, but she's kind of moving as a chess piece. She's kind of moving in the same way that she's kind of acting like a maw.
Julie Beth has made an excellent point here.
Yeah.
Unsullied, they're and this was something that's in my notes on the page. I didn't get to in the main part of the stream, but we know that the trees have their faces carved in them. That's completely obvious. And, a lot of people might think, oh, okay, faces carved. That's totally what the trees are, and that's it. Except that's superficially that seems the same, but they're not really acting the same. They're not going for the thing.
Are we of the opinion that the faces are actually moving? They're just too slow for people to notice, or is that just me?
I know that's a very interesting idea.
Because Theon thinks that, but you can't really trust anything Theon says. Like at one point, the tree in Winterfell is scowling at him, and another time it's laughing at him. We don't know if that's just because Theon's crazy. I'd like to think they actually are moving. It's just they move over a course of years, and people don't really notice it.
I think it's more reflective.
Okay,
of
we
what's
can fight
going
if you
on.
want to.
No, well, I think it is just more reflective of what's going on with Theon. But what I was getting to with here is with the worship, especially the worship outside the pyramids, is the function of the trees is not the same function as the functions of the fire. There's nowhere in the story that I can think of where it says trees demand anything. You go to them, you pray to them, the gods are in everything. So it's like, it's not very structured. It's more like the animism. So going on with Julie Beth's idea here, what's it called? The harpies above the pyramids are like faces or identities, at least, that are carved into the Sand Kings towers. The one in Marine, Dany's pyramid, at this point has never either doesn't have a harpy or it's never been described. So I think
in the show
a very
they
long
topple.
time.
In the show, there's a scene where they pull it down and it slides down the side of the pyramid.
Right.
When that
happened. When that happened in the show, like my heart stopped for a second because I have this long running theory that she's going to be the pyramid topper. She's going to return with Drogon, and that's where they're going to land.
Physically, tear the harpy off and throw it down, and
something like that.
Beat you over the head.
Like
symbolism with it, right?
Yes, because that's her spot. She's carving it. This is it. And I think in the show they unfurled the banners, like Dany's Targaryen banner. Instead, they put it up there, which when Aegon and his sisters first came to Westeros, they did not have that 3-headed dragon banner.
They didn't do heraldry at all.
They didn't do heraldry at all. That was something that essentially the religious mobiles, the seven, the faith of the seven, that was spurred on by the union with the faith of the seven. That's what gave the Targaryens acceptance into Westeros. It was at that point, it was the mobiles that created this face, that created this Targaryen banner. And that's where that came from. So that's a religious militant symbol. Despite George saying that, that's what it is.
It's also the point where the maw gets bigger and bigger, and I kind of see Dany and their armies as she starts out like this individual, like a dragon. She's born or hatched during her wedding, and then it expands. And during the course of the books, her body gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Right. And then at that point, when she uses the whip, which is like a dragon's tail the harpy's whip to claim the Unsullied, they're becoming like a part of her body in that way. Like they're becoming all her claws and all her teeth and dragon claws and also her firepower, because the spears, you can throw spears, so they're like a firepower too.
Right.
So that's something that's so that kind of fits with your idea. But it doesn't matter how you interpret it. It just means like her army gets bigger, or her dragon body gets bigger, or whatever. But it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually, with the Dothraki, we expect to join as well, and then all the ships of Victarion. You kind of get like on the ocean and the whole continent of Essos, you get like a dragon that has a wingspan from the north of Essos until the south of the ocean, the southern sea. That's a dragon that mounts the world, literally.
Well, and we should call out that, keep in mind, when the dragons become problematic, she locks them up in the pyramid, in the dungeons, which is literally like a maw, and they begin carving the stone wall away and carving a burrow into the wall. So it literally starts to sound literally like that same physical description of, it wasn't a door anymore. It was just a hole that the dragons are literally burrowing into the pyramid and becoming this maw, and the dragons are constrained by their container. They're not growing because they're bottled up inside the pyramid.
And that is
he doesn't get eaten, but he gets burned.
Right.
And what that's consumed. Does consumed. It doesn't have to be literally like eaten, but you're consumed by something. And that is also something that Woe says, they will only, the mobiles will only grow. They will only grow as big as their surroundings. That's exactly
they won't denude their environment. Right.
So if Crest didn't twist them by feeding them on an off schedule, they would have stayed like in their container. But not only was he cruel to them, he let them out, and then that's
well, he merged with them. They became a hybrid entity that was, his cruelty and all of his bad personality attributes overlaid on top of their physical abilities.
But
they literally are a mirror that reflect who he is as a person. A reasonable person that took care of them as a responsible adult would have never caused the situation.
That's also like something philosophical, because when you think about like the gods in our real world religions, a lot of the arguments about it is like, but why would you? Because they're cruel with all the disasters and death and disease, etc., and hunger. It's kind of like it also appears in that way.
Right.
So you have a lot of people arguing that, like, who are atheists or something.
Right.
Like, well, if gods exist, they're cruel.
Right. And I think we're meant to take that from, like, compare Beric and Melisandre and Moqorro. Theoretically, they're all part of the same religion, but they feel like very different characters. It's because I don't think that's bad writing. I think that what George is telling you is that the religion, they're not just aspects of the religion. They are their own people, but they reflect aspects of the religion through their own characters.
Yeah. Because everybody... You have variations in the same religion on how people act with it or use it or believe in it.
I'm trying to find a quote where it says that the Weirwoods drink blood or they demand blood. Can anybody find that for me?
They don't demand blood, but there's like I think the moment where the Maester is dying and his blood soaks there, but he sacrificed himself, so he wasn't he wasn't being killed for the tree. He sacrificed himself to save Tion. Was killed, was hit by a spear, and then dragged himself to the weirwood tree, which he initially did not believe in that religion at all. But
he had a change of heart.
I think he realized, it's never outspoken, but he realizes when Bran's gone and Tion is going nuts, that he realizes, like, ooh, what Jojen was warning about is actually, I was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I know there's when Davos is over in White Harbor, and they talk about like stringing entrails from the tree, but that is actually, when you read the whole
Background
section,
story.
The whole background story to that, and I think it's even touched on in the World Book as well. That's actually more like an offering or celebration, because that's what they did to slavers. So that was like an anti-slavery type of thing. So, which is gruesome, but I don't know that means that the trees in that case demanded anything.
No. I think it's comparable to Joffrey putting heads on spikes.
And this one here from Julie Beth, I don't know what anybody else thinks about this. I'm just mentioning this now. To me, I always thought, that one reads to me that it's like that the free folk burn their dead.
Yeah.
Because they don't want them coming back as whites. And I always thought that read to me as some sort of something to protect themselves. Like that was a white that was burnt, or one of their own dead that had come back that was burnt, maybe as some sort of way to some sort of ritual of protection for the rest of the clan. I don't know.
Right.
But if anything, that part about the weirwood that in what's it called, the free folk village, it's the white tree. Yeah. So it's like the biggest tree he's ever seen. So it's like big. That means to me when George uses big, it means like, ooh, big clue. And then what are the clues? One is the reference about Mormont asking, yeah, now we know. I've always wondered why the free folk wanted to burn their dead, but now we know, right? And then the second thing that's very important is that John and Mormont both agree that their father said, you can never lie before a tree. And why could you never lie before a tree? Because the tree, like, it has a green seer beneath it, and the green seer would know if you lie. So if like a captive criminal is brought before the tree, he cannot lie like, oh, I didn't do it. No, because the green seer would know you killed or stole, you killed that person, or you stole that sheep, or you raped that daughter. So that's that's an interpretation. I don't know, but I don't see anything. I know it's often used to like, oh, this was a sacrifice, but I don't see it in that. Certainly not in that scene. It's suggested in the scene where Bran dreams, when he has that, in his last chapter, when he sees that person being killed. But I don't know. It's not. Maybe it could have been a criminal who was killed before the tree, because the green seer said, no, he's guilty. I don't know.
That huge tree, and I mean, Julie Beth, she's not, especially in the terms of Sandkings, that's a good point. That weirwood to me, being so huge and so gnarly. Have you guys ever read Men of Greywater Station? There's the one huge tree that's essentially, it's described very much like a weirwood. It's this huge, big white tree. It's a big white tree that the humans that have are coming through trying to create some sort of chemical warfare element, they're trying to like go through and like cut everything down, but they can't cut down this one tree. Like their blades just won't even go into it. And in Ice and Fire, there's sort of a underlying theme that cutting into a human, cutting into a person is an act of fire. And that's kind of what this white tree seemed to me. It was a protector of sorts, even though it's like big and scary and gnarly looking and all this other stuff. That doesn't, that's how George plays with things, you know. That doesn't mean that that's literally like the bad guy. But that's how it read to me. So it's, I don't know, for me, I'm rambling a little bit now because I'm getting it. It's interesting to get these other ideas as well. So, right.
Yeah, that's a quote.
That's the quote.
I'm wondering if depends on what goes down with Theon at the tree at the two ponds at the Crofters Village, because we may be seeing a split between like fire sacrifices and blood sacrifices. Like the old way, the northern way, is blood sacrifices, like in Julie's quote. Like if Theon gets burned in front of the tree, is that somehow cheating the tree of the blood? Or I don't know. There might be a...
Yeah, but I don't think like Julie's quote, I would say, well, you have this image of the woman who grabs the captive and who does it with a sickle, but it goes over 1,000 and 1,000 years back during a Bronze Age. So it's not abnormal that she would have a sickle. It wasn't always just a ritualistic weapon. But she probably is kind of someone who interprets the whispers of the leaves and the whispers of the trees. But so she would be like a translator of what a greenseer would say. I think that's her role more.
Right.
But yeah, it's called a captive, and it's not. And also at the same time, you don't see it again 1,000 years later. It's something that happened 1,000 years back. Maybe it's some memory stored into that happened once before the tree, and then every greenseer after that original one who sees it, he has this reaction like, no, I don't want human sacrifice or something like that. But you don't know. Like if we look 1,000 years later to what happened to Ned Stark with Joffrey, his beheading at the Sept.
Right.
You know, that's also a religious place. How do you know whether it was we know it's an execution. But, you know, maybe someone who dreams about it 1,000 years later of happening, he might think, oh, that's a sacrifice. You don't know. So that's kind of like...
There's very similar language about his legs drumming against the ground.
Yeah.
In Sansa's chapter, I think, or she remembers her father's terrible drumming of his legs against the ground, which is very similar to the scene that Julie is quoting there. So we're clearly supposed to think about those as a set.
Yeah, that and if you think of Bran's arc, that so far what we have, his very first lesson and his very last lesson are
executions.
Yeah, they're connected.
They're connected. They're lessons that a king has to learn. Somebody who swings the sword, passes the judgment type of thing. The Northern Way. The first thing he learns and the last thing he witnesses is the judgment of a king. And it was Elio or Ran, however you know him. He did say that the woman doing the cutting is a priestess. So she speculatively has some sort of, some sort of connection there. So
it's clearly druidic imagery. That's always been the kind of probably not historically accurate, but the assumption is that the druids killed their human sacrifices under a holly tree with a golden sickle because it was symbolically harvesting, you would harvest a plant. And George is playing on that, whether or not that actually happened.
So even if the blood went into the tree, if the tree drank it, Bran is psionically able to taste it. That's the tree system, but this goes into why Bran is going to be the next leader of Westeros, that I think a lot of people are overlooking, and were so shocked by the end of the TV show. Bran's learning this whole green way of being a king, and it might be an old way. Might do it because he doesn't like what he sees. He's still a little kid. However it's going to be.
But his response to that what he sees 1,000 years back is much stronger and more emotional than what he sees in his first chapter. Then he's being brave, and he's seeing Garrett killed, and he doesn't say no, don't. It's kind of, that's, I think it's for him, it becomes more emotional. He's more connected to it, and that's maybe the reason why he sees it, to realize, like, you're not gonna, if you have to take somebody's life, prefer to be merciful. And that's what we see. We don't see Bran from Bran's point of view anymore, but we see him later with Theon, in Winterfell, through the tree. And then we see somebody who's merciful, who initially is angry when he first sees Theon, but because Theon noticed something angry, but then there's a touch by the leaf, and eventually he almost weeps for Theon when he knows what happened to him, and is like, you were a jerk, but you didn't deserve this.
Right. And this is the difference between like learning from, if you look back, you get lost. In George's world, and the story that it's most prominently just on page is For a Single Yesterday. It's not looking back that's getting lost. It's looking back and getting stuck in the past, not progressing forward, not having any societal progression. That whole story involves a tree with a guy that plays music that sits at the bottom of the tree, and he takes a drug like weirwood paste, and he does a mind trip back through time. And the whole point of that, they get visions. The other people start doing it too, and they get visions. The point of them going back mentally, doing these mental time trips, is they learn from the past to rebuild this future, because they, and that story, have just gone through this huge, essentially it was a double war. It was a long night, and now they are in their interregnum phase where they have to start rebuilding. In George's world, the interregnum is when the war, during the wars, you lost flight. And then the rebuild after the wars, during the interregnum and forward, that's when they regain flight. So when Bloodraven tells Bran that you'll never walk again, but you will fly, that's a Martinworld thing, saying, okay, you're going to lead the progress forward. So things may have been, looking back, things may have been judged and handled this way, but going forward, it's not going to be the same, because Bran doesn't like it, because something's going to happen. He's not going to be king. He's going to be a leader, and the whole structure is going to change. I guess what I'm thinking is there's no demand for the blood. Like the trees don't demand it that I can think of. Humans might go and make their sacrifices and hang the entrails and sacrifice somebody in front of a tree because of a judgment, but feeding one or what is it, like feeding yourself for selfish purposes is different than feeding the many. I'm confusing my thought at them. Yeah.
Well, it's not an act of like worship of slavery. Which is in like the case of like a Damon Julian, it really is someone who is soliciting the worship and soliciting the followers and soliciting obedience and subservience. I think Bran is going to be kind of like an anti-king, is that he'll technically be in charge, but he won't do any of the things that kings do, which is try to establish a bloodline, try to demand worship, try to like he will theoretically be the arbiter, but he won't be the fiery conqueror. He won't be like the Robert Baratheon who just wants to be king because it's awesome to be king. He's going to be you always elect the guy who doesn't want the job, so he's going to be that. And I think Bran is going to be like a 1,000-year king kind of thing. By the time Bran ages and dies, everybody that remembers the old feudal system will have died off, and that Bran will basically be a way to transition out of that political system into something else.
Right. That's there's a difference. Yeah, there's a difference between serving the many and serving yourself. Giving people a choice or not giving people a choice. So
is there anything else we want to say about space ants?
Well, if you want to read,
there's a story with flying ants, right?
Yes, it is. Slideshow. Sorry, I had to think about it for a second. I'm like, slideshow. If you want another, and I'll write that down. If you want another good George Bug story, Put it
in the description.
I'll put it in the description. Let's see if I can do it here really quickly. So,
we're at 1 hour and 50 right now.
Okay. Yeah, I was keeping an eye on that. So I guess just about 5 or 10 more minutes. See that, I think analysis needs to be done on the religion of the world, because a lot of things that seem superficially the same don't have the same requirements or the same functions or the same desired outcome as the other. And that's because a lot of it does overlap. So you are going to see like Bran with the Psylink, you are going to see Dany with her Psylink to her dragons, but that doesn't mean that it's all literally the same. That could be a very interesting discussion.
Right.
Let me see if I can find this other one real quickly though. There it is. I'll put this. But also, if you want another George, this is taking forever to load up. If you want another George, oh no, it's not letting me post it. I'll try it again. There it is. You want another good George slideshow. That is also another good one that shows that just because something is like on the surface, like superficially, it looks the same, they actually function very, very differently, because there's more than they do different things. They're not all the same.
They're also pets.
So that is and then the other one,
they build
and again, this is part of what we're doing here, is encouraging people to read more and more of these stories, his backstory, his whole catalog of stories. There's 80 stories. There's 80 stories. Because you really start to get the bigger picture of how nuanced every one of these little mini arcs.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some things that always come back from the very beginning. One of the first things, like when you mentioned the mists in the shop, it's actually there's like a red mist, like a red haze, red illuminated, he calls it. And well, when I read that, I know like, oops, this is not a good idea, because red is something that he always uses as a warning in every story. It's even if it's a sympathetic character,
right?
If they have red hair, they die. Ygritte. But there's like
Danger.
The troll in the 7 Times Never Kill a Man. He has red hair. Once I read that, I knew he's gonna die, and he
Right.
died. It's also like it can be a false messenger, but somehow they end up. It's not. It's always the wrong way. Like it might be good meaning. They might have good intentions or good, but their beliefs, there's something wrong and something happens. It's like with Sansa and her knight who gives her the the poisoned tears of Liz. Dantos, he rode a red stallion, and the red stallion, Drogo rides a red stallion, same thing, and it always reappears. So like even those the people who chew what's it called again? The red
The heddles, Masha Heddle. Yeah. Sour leaf.
Yeah, Masha Heddle, she dies. And we have that also as predictable for one of the Freys and our Morrill, Maester Morrill.
Yeah.
Sour leaf. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sorry, I'm reading comments as
All
well.
right.
like, ooh, good stuff. Yeah.
We could go on.
80s. I know we could go on. We could go on 80 stories worth, but I think we're gonna. I think I'm gonna cut it off here. You guys are crazy. My screen's blinking in and out. But so a few more, just a couple things. Something that I meant to do as part of the mainstream that I forgot to mention. So just to close things out, if you want to read some non-George stuff, I recommend Redwall. Redwall, they're about to make a television show about. So this is supposed to be like a kid's book, but no, it's excellent. And there's, I think, 13 books in this series. So if you have like a middle-aged kid, middle-aged books are generally written
like us.
Between. Yeah, between like himself, because they're starting a television show on this pretty soon. So Redwall is a good one. And then also I started this, I've had this book for a few weeks now, but I've only just barely started it, is the 2020 Hugo Award winner. Which way is my camera going? That way. A memory called Empire. So especially if you like a female main character protagonist point of view, this is a good one. So those are my non-George book recommendations, because I do read other things. Do you guys have anything you want to mention?
Well, I didn't have there's some recommendations, but the one book I was just thinking about a non-George book that related for me to Simon Kress was American Psycho.
Wow, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's
yes.
Yeah, that is like Patrick Bateman, but then with alien ants.
Right.
Alien bugs.
Right.
So, yeah. But I'm not sure whether I can recommend it, because I once...
Are you noting?
I read it as far as when he killed the puppy, and then I stopped reading American Psycho. I couldn't continue with that. But then, yeah, a book that I highly recommend, but it's old. That's, of course.
Wait a minute. Wait. Whoa.
Is that the one we just talked about? Or no,
Lord
that was
of Light.
Signpost.
Lord of Light.
The last knee.
That's probably what
Everybody drink.
I know.
And every time we mention Armageddon Rag or Zelazny, drink.
Interregnum. Oh, I have Dark Rising upstairs. I do. I have Julie Beth again. Yeah, I have Dark Rising upstairs. It's good. Shattered Jack, do you have a recommendation?
My recommendation that I won't shut up about, everybody needs to read Stephen King's Dance Macabre, wherein he freely admits to being extremely derivative. He says, there are basically only 7 horror stories ever written. These are what they are. The werewolf story, the vampire story, the Frankenstein story, Prometheus, Fire of the Gods, yada, yada, yada. And discussing the reason why sci-fi, gothic, and horror all overlap. Arguably, Twilight Zone is not science fiction. Neither is it exactly horror. It is, basically gothic. But what is it that distinguishes sci-fi from gothic, and why do people always mention them as being adjacent? What attributes do they share? Where do they differ? Extremely instructive, and especially if you get the audiobooks, there have been enough. It was originally written in the early 80s. There have been enough later versions that if you get the most recent version of the audiobook, there's like 3 forward for the 4th edition, forward for the 5th edition. He's adding stuff to it that the later versions of the audiobooks actually have things, significant amount of content added to them about movies and things that have come out since then. Obviously, there's been a lot happened, and I think the most recent movie that had come out at the time that book was published was probably Jaws, as far as like game changers in the horror genre.
I'm getting a little.
But for this kind of analysis, where you really want to understand the structures of the stories, especially since George is not really writing in any one of these genres, he's using sci-fi elements, horror elements, gothic elements, with fantasy furniture spread in a very thin layer over the top. Excellent book to shape the way it kind of gives you a strategy for thinking about books and stories. So
yeah, it is a really good book. I have it on Audible right now, so if anybody does prefer, or it's easier for listening right now, Dance Macabre is on Audible. And I
actually
also
don't even like Stephen King's writing that much, but to hear him talk about writing, I would pay a ton of money to hear a George-style version of Dance Macabre, where George just talks about how stories are glued together. I would pay a lot of money for that. If you're listening.
Yeah. Hello, George. I would also recommend Stephen King's On Writing. His book is just called On Writing, and it's on writing. So that is a really good one as well. I think that's about it. So thank you guys for hanging around for the after party chat. This was fun. This is interesting because I wanted to be able to get through the main story, hopefully encourage a few people to read that one. Yes, there are 80 stories in Martinworld. There are 80
and a lot to say about each of them.
In Martinworld. So I hesitantly caution people against trying to do too many absolutely one-to-one comparisons, especially if they've only read 3 or 4 or even 10 old George stories, because it really takes a lot to start seeing the true pattern. The 2 Dream Songs anthologies, it's a great
start.
It's a great start, but that has only about 35% of George's work in it. So you can read all of those, but those are less than half. I mean, I did the math once. It was like 35% of George's stories. So keep reading.
But these are the ones that he picked himself,
right?
And he has a lot of explanation in before to represent him, to represent his ideas, to represent his writing. He explains a lot of it, and then I think he kind of picked it out in relation to A Song of Ice and Fire.
Right. So, and if you do have dream songs, do not skip the little mini autobiographies before
Yes.
each
No,
section.
they're jewels.
They're priceless.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
that's how you get to know the man, you know? Yeah. So, okay. Well, that is going to be it. Thank you guys for being here. I'm working on Night Flyers next. Maybe I'll get to meet Houseman one day and smack anybody that thinks that that story is all about just being gross. No. So.
No.
It's another one of his twisted love stories, but we'll get into that later. So, all right. Thank you guys for being here. And until next time, you don't got to
See ya.
go home, but you can't stay here.
See